The blizzard hit Detroit like a sledgehammer. Inside her crumbling home, 72-year-old Hattie Palmer felt her furnace give its final mechanical sigh and die, plunging her into the cold. Then came the pounding. Through the frosted glass she saw 9 massive silhouettes. 9 leather-clad giants were on her porch, but one was collapsing, held up by the man in the center. A dark stain was spreading across the wounded man's jacket. Her arthritic hands trembled on the deadbolt. This wasn't just fear of the storm. This was fear of the trouble they were running from. The men would die in the cold, but the wounded one would die first. She had an impossible choice. Lock the door and let 9 strangers die on her porch. Or open it and invite the violence that was hunting them right into her home. What Hattie didn't know was that these men weren't just running from the storm. They were running from a private army of trained killers, and the secret they were carrying was about to bring a war to her doorstep. 5:17 a.m. The cold was a physical presence in the room. It wasn't just in the air, it was a heavy blanket that settled on Hattie Palmer's chest, a dull ache that found the iron in her 72-year-old bones. Her alarm clock, a pale green digital relic from a bygone decade, hadn't made a sound. The power had flickered and died 3 times during the night, and its display now just blinked a sullen 12 o'clock. 12 o'clock, 12 o'clock. But Hattie didn't need an alarm. The cold was her clock. She swung her legs out of bed, her feet meeting the icy hardwood floor with a wince. For a moment she sat on the edge of the mattress, her breath pluming in the dim light of the bedroom. The house groaned around her. It was a living thing, this 2-story Victorian on Detroit's forgotten west side, and it was in its death throes. Hattie could hear the wind whistling through the cracked window seals, a high-pitched, mournful sound that was her only regular companion. With a sigh, she pushed herself up, her posture, even in the darkness, instinctively straightening. Shoulders back, Hattie. No matter what. Walter's voice, 15 years gone but still as clear as the bell on his old army-issued watch. She pulled a thick, knitted cardigan over her thin nightgown. It was one of 3 she wore, layered, from October until May. Downstairs, the kitchen was even colder. She ran the tap, but only a rusty brown trickle sputtered from the faucet before it gave up. Pipes are freezing again. She'd have to use the bottled water, the precious gallon jug she bought on the 1st of the month, for her coffee. She spooned the dark, chalky powder of the store-brand instant coffee into a chipped porcelain mug, followed by a smaller spoonful of powdered milk. Real cream was a memory, a luxury from a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. She heated the water in a small, scorched pan on the gas stove, whose blue flame was the only reliable warmth in the entire house. She carried her mug to the kitchen table, her movements slow and deliberate. Her hands, gnarled by arthritis, were her body's greatest betrayal. She sat and opened her pill container. Thursday. She picked up the small blue pill splitter. Click. The tiny, oval tablet for her high blood pressure was now 2 jagged halves. One for today. One for tomorrow. She did the same with her diabetes medication. This grim arithmetic was the first task of every morning. Stretch $1,200 a month to cover a mortgage, utilities that barely worked, and a body that was actively failing. Dignity, Hattie. That's the one thing they can't take. She looked out the window as she sipped the bitter coffee. Her street, once vibrant with families and block parties, was now an urban prairie. 3 houses on her block were standing, including her own. The rest were hollowed-out shells, their windows boarded up like closed, unblinking eyes. The city had mowed them down, leaving empty lots where snow now drifted in pristine, uninterrupted waves. It was a clean, white sheet draped over a corpse. Her house was the last holdout, a crumbling monument to a better time. Walter had bought it for her when he came back from his second tour. A palace for my queen, he'd called it. Now the palace was a prison. The siding was peeling off in long, curling strips, like old skin, she thought. The roof, which Walter himself had shingled, now leaked so badly that the attic was a minefield of mismatched pots and buckets. On rainy nights, they played a hollow, off-key percussion section. The wallpaper in the dining room, once a cheerful yellow floral, was bubbled and stained with a brown, map-like spread of water damage. The house wasn't just a shelter, it was a character in her story, a fellow sufferer, groaning under the weight of time and neglect. Hattie turned on the small 13-inch television that sat on her counter. Its screen flickered to life, buzzing with static before settling on the local morning news. And there he was, Councilman Cade Prescott. He stood at a podium, a backdrop of a shiny blue and green New Detroit logo behind him. He was young, with a crisp white shirt, a jawline that looked precision-cut, and a smile that never ever reached his cold, assessing eyes. He looked like a wolf in $1,000 suit, and Hattie knew, with the certainty of her own name, that he was the one pulling her world apart. "An unprecedented investment in our city's future," Prescott said, his voice a smooth, practiced bomb. "This is about community-forward revitalization. We've identified key blight zones that are a drain on our city's resources and a threat to public safety." Hattie let out a quiet, bitter snort. "Blight zones." He meant her home. "We'll be working with our partners in development to acquire these distressed properties," he continued, "and offering a fair, compassionate relocation package for any legacy residents." Compassionate relocation. Hattie's mind flashed to Mr. O'Malley 3 doors down. He'd refused Prescott's first compassionate offer, a check for $10,000. 2 weeks later, a suspicious fire started on his back porch at 3 a.m. The O'Malleys got out with their bathrobes. They took the next offer. She thought of Mrs. Petrov, who'd lived on the corner since 1968. A slip on her icy porch, ice that had formed from a burst water main the city never came to fix, had broken her hip. Her children, living in Arizona, sold the house for a pittance to a shell corporation called Future Bright Homes. Hattie had looked them up. The company was registered to an address in the suburbs. Kate Prescott's brother-in-law. He was a vulture picking the bones of a dying neighborhood, and he was using city funds to do it. He saw empty lots and profit margins. Hattie saw the place where her son took his first steps, the porch where Walter kissed her after 20 years of marriage, the garden where she'd buried her dog Buster in '98. The interview finished, replaced by a jarringly loud car commercial. Hattie clicked the TV off, the silence rushing back in heavier this time. Prescott's slick, false image was an insult to everything she knew to be true. Her gaze drifted from the kitchen down the short, cold hallway to the study. Walter's room. She pushed the door open. It was the one room she kept exactly as he'd left it. Dust motes danced in the sliver of light from the window. The air smelled of old paper, leather, and the faint, phantom scent of the pipe tobacco he'd quit a decade before he passed. And there, on the desk, was the heart of the room. Walter's CB radio. It was a Cobra 148 GTL, a heavy slab of black steel and polished chrome. The microphone coiled beside it like a sleeping snake. Taped to the side was a small, laminated card, yellowed with age, with one word typed on it: wrench. His call sign. Walter had been a mechanic in Vietnam. A wrench. He could fix anything: a sputtering Jeep, a jammed rifle, a broken heart. That radio wasn't just a hobby. It was a lifeline. It was a symbol of a code that Hattie felt was now extinct. In Walter's world, you didn't leave anyone behind. You covered your six. You ran into the fire, not away from it. A promise was a promise, and loyalty was the only currency that mattered. Hattie ran a stiff finger over the cold, metal grill of the microphone. This radio was a relic from an era of honor, sitting silent in an age of greed. Walter's world was built on a handshake and your word. Prescott's world was built on shell corporations and fine print clauses that stole your home. The contrast made her chest ache. This was her world now. A world of liars on TV and ghosts in the study. She was alone, fighting a one-woman war against a man who had the whole city in his pocket. She was about to turn and leave the study when she heard it. A sound from the basement. A deep, mechanical groan, followed by a metallic clank, and then silence. The low, reassuring hum of the ancient furnace, the one sound that stood between her and the killing cold, was gone. Hattie Palmer stood perfectly still, her hand on the cold radio, and listened to the silence. The wind howled outside as if laughing at her. The real storm was no longer just on television. It was here. The silence that followed the furnace's death was a new kind of cold. It was absolute, a crushing void where the low, comforting rumble of the burner used to be. Hattie's hand was still on Walter's radio, her knuckles white. She could already feel the temperature in the study begin to drop, the house surrendering its frail warmth to the invading air. The wind outside didn't just howl anymore. It shrieked, a solid wall of sound that made the whole house shudder. This was it. The March blizzard the news had warned about, the one they'd called a generational storm, had arrived. It wasn't just a storm, it was a siege. And it had just breached her first line of defense. Panic, cold and sharp, pricked at the base of her skull. She was 72 with a bad heart, diabetes, and no heat. The temperature was projected to hit 10 below zero by midnight, not accounting for the 60-mile-per-hour wind. She was alone. Her son was in San Diego, her daughter in Florida. They wouldn't even know for days. She was just another statistic in a failing house on a forgotten street. She pulled the cardigan tighter, her mind racing. Space heater? No, the ancient wiring would blow a fuse in seconds. Fireplace. Walter had walled it up in '87, said it was inefficient. She had blankets, sweaters, the gas stove. She could boil water. She could try to survive the night. Shoulders back, Hattie. She made her way to the front living room, the one with the large picture window. She pulled back the heavy, floral drapes. She could see nothing. The world outside was gone, replaced by a churning, horizontal chaos of white. It was as if someone was holding a bedsheet an inch from the glass. The snow wasn't falling, it was attacking. The wind hit the window with a boom that sounded like a physical blow. And then, through the roar of the blizzard, came a new sound. Thump, thump, thump. It was low, powerful, and rhythmic. It was not the wind. It was coming from her front porch. Hattie's blood went as cold as the air. She stood frozen in the middle of the living room. Oh, who would be out in this? No one. No one sane. Her mind flashed to the news, the stories of break-ins, of squatters looking for shelter in the neighborhood's abandoned homes. Thump, thump, thump. Louder this time. More urgent. It was a fist. A very large fist. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird in a cage. Don't answer it. Don't you dare answer it, Hattie. She backed away from the window, her slippered feet silent on the cold floor. She was a single, elderly woman. Answering the door in a blizzard in this neighborhood was suicide. She'd call 911. She fumbled for the old wall-mounted phone in the kitchen. Dead. The line was dead. The storm had taken that too. Thump, thump, thump. A voice roared, barely audible through the thick oak door and the screaming wind. Please, help. Someone. The plea was raw, a sound of pure desperation. It cut through her fear just for a second. They sound like they're in trouble. But trouble was a contagion. Trouble was what Kate Prescott used to clean up the neighborhood. Trouble was what you barred your door against. Hattie crept down the short hall to the front door. She stood on the throw rug, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles ached. She peered through the small, frosted glass peephole. All she could see were shapes, massive, distorted silhouettes that blocked out what little gray light remained. There wasn't one. There were many. A whole group. This was it. The scenario she'd played out in her mind 100 times. They would force the door. They would take her pills, the little money she had in the cookie jar, her television. They would hurt her. She was frail. She couldn't fight. The pounding stopped. A new sound began, a desperate, frantic scraping as if someone was clawing at the wood. And then the voice again, closer to the mail slot, cracked and broken. Ma'am, please. He's hurt. He won't make it. We just need, please. The man was crying. We're so close to it, his voice was shattering. Hattie's hand, gnarled and trembling, moved toward the deadbolt. What are you doing? Walter's voice was sharp. You don't open the door, Hattie. Not in this. You don't know who's out there. But then another voice, her own mother's from a childhood spent in the Depression. You always help a body who needs it. Always. She was trapped. Trapped between a lifetime of caution and a single, defining moment of humanity. She looked at the door. They were out there, dying in a storm that would kill her too, just more slowly. Men like Kate Prescott thrived on the idea that everyone was isolated, that no one would open the door, that fear would always win. He counted on people being too afraid to help their neighbors so he could pick them off one by one. The men on her porch were isolated. She was isolated. In that, they were the same. If you believe no one should have to face the storm alone, hit that like button. Only people who side with the bullies will keep scrolling. Hattie Palmer closed her eyes. Her hand was no longer trembling. It was steady. She wasn't a victim in a dying house. She was Walter Wrench Palmer's widow. And she would not let people die on her porch. She turned the deadbolt. The click sounded like a gunshot in the silent house. She turned the knob and pulled the heavy door inward. A wall of ice, snow, and wind blasted into her hallway, stealing her breath. And with it they came. 9 of them. Giants. They were mountains of black leather, denim, and ice. Snow caked their beards and helmets. They stumbled in, a chaotic mass of frozen misery, filling her small entryway, bringing the storm in with them. And then she saw him. The man in the center, the one called Sledge, wasn't just big, he was a monolith. He was half carrying, half dragging another man, whose arm was draped over his shoulder. The second man, Rook, was limp. His helmet was gone and his face was a pale, waxy gray. A dark, spreading stain, almost black in the dim light, was frozen solid across his leather jacket just under the ribs. Hattie's hands flew to her mouth. That wasn't melted snow. Sledge looked at her, his eyes wild and desperate under a layer of ice. His voice was a ragged plea. "Ma'am, please." He's shot. He looked past her into the cold, dark house. We can't stay out here." Hattie's mind went blank. The fear, the cold, the wind, it all evaporated, replaced by a single, sharp, undeniable fact. A man was bleeding to death in her doorway. The word "shot" hung in the air, heavier and more dangerous than the storm itself. "Get him in," she said. Her voice was thin, but it didn't tremble. "Get him in and shut that door. You're letting all the heat out." It was a ridiculous thing to say. The furnace was dead. There was no heat. But the words were an anchor, a return to practicality in a moment of pure chaos. Sledge nodded, his face a mask of pained relief. He and another man, one with a long braided beard, half dragged, half carried the wounded man, Rook, past her. The other 7 men filed in behind them, a silent, grim procession of frozen giants. They didn't barge. They entered with a strange, almost practiced deference, as if they were acutely aware of the sacrilege of bringing their violent world into her home. They were impossibly large, filling her narrow hallway with the smell of wet leather, gasoline, and something metallic and sharp. Blood. The last man in, a kid who couldn't have been more than 25, pushed the heavy oak door shut. The thud of the deadbolt locking them inside felt final, an irrevocable choice. The roar of the blizzard was instantly muffled, reduced to a dull, angry howl. The house was now filled with a new, terrible energy. It was the coiled tension of desperate men, the sound of ragged, panting breaths, the rhythmic, wet dripping of melting snow and ice onto her hardwood floors. "The kitchen," Hattie commanded, pointing. "On the table. Now." They moved. Sledge and the braid-bearded man maneuvered Rook through the doorway and gently, so gently, lowered him onto Hattie's worn formica kitchen table. Rook let out a low, shuddering groan, his eyes rolling back. "Jesus, Rook, stay with us," Sledge muttered, his gloved hands hovering uselessly over the wound. The other men fanned out, not wandering but securing. It was the only word Hattie could think of. One man, tall and impossibly thin, moved to the living room window, peering through the drapes. Another stood by the back door, his head cocked, listening. They weren't relaxing, they were posting guards. Hattie ignored them and focused on the man on her table. "Get that jacket off him. And get me the whiskey, the good bottle, top left cabinet, and all the towels you can find in the linen closet upstairs." She was barking orders, and to her surprise, the men moved without question. Sledge fumbled with the zipper on Rook's jacket, his thick, frozen fingers clumsy. It's stuck. The blood." Hattie pushed him aside. "Move." She grabbed a pair of kitchen shears from a drawer. With steady hands, she cut through the thick, frozen leather, the snip snip snip, a sharp counterpoint to Rook's pained breathing. She peeled the jacket away, then the blood-soaked flannel shirt beneath. The wound was high on his side, a ragged, ugly hole, dark and pulsing. It wasn't he bleeding heavily anymore. The cold had slowed it, but Hattie knew that was a temporary mercy. As the room's cold air hit him, he started to shiver violently. "He's going into shock," she said, more to herself than to them. "We have to stop the bleeding and get him warm." "We tried," Sledge said, his voice raw. "We used a pressure bandage, but it soaked through. Get me that whiskey." A bottle was pressed into her hand. She ripped the seal off, poured a small amount onto a dish towel, and, ignoring Rook's sudden, sharp intake of breath, began to clean the wound. "Hold him," she snapped. Sledge and the braided man put their hands on Rook's shoulders, holding him steady as he writhed. For 10 minutes, the only sounds were Hattie's terse commands, Rook's pained whimpers, and the tearing of cloth. She worked with a grim, practiced focus, a memory from a first aid course Walter had forced her to take decades ago. "You never know, Hat," he'd said. A man who knows how to fix things needs a woman who knows how to patch him up. She packed the wound, bound his ribs with strips torn from a clean bedsheet, and covered him in every blanket she owned. Finally she stepped back, her hands covered in a stranger's blood. Rook's breathing was still shallow, but the shivering had eased. He was unconscious, but he was stable. For now. Hattie turned, leaning against the counter, and faced the man who had brought this nightmare to her door. Sledge was watching her, his face unreadable. The ice had melted from his beard, revealing a strong jaw and eyes that were far too old for his face. They were soldier's eyes. Walter had had those eyes. "You're a long way from a hospital, son," Hattie said, her voice heavy. "And 911 isn't coming in this. You'd best tell me what's going on." Sledge ran a hand over his face. He looked at his men who were all watching him. The thin man by the window. The young kid by the back door. The braided man by the table. They were an army waiting for their general. "We didn't have a choice, ma'am," Sledge began. He didn't make excuses. He didn't sugarcoat it. He spoke in short, clipped sentences, the facts laid bare like an autopsy. "We're the forgotten sons. All of us, vets. Army Marines." He paused, then reached inside his own leather vest. Hattie flinched, but he didn't pull out a weapon. He pulled out a small, black, rectangular object. A portable hard drive. He placed it on the counter next to her blood-stained shears. "This is why." Hattie looked at the small, innocuous object. "What is it?" It's everything," Sledge said, his voice dropping. "We've been watching him for 6 months. The man who's been burning out your neighborhood." Hattie's blood ran colder than the blizzard. "Prescott." Sledge nodded. "Councilman Cade Prescott. He's not just buying up property. He's using the abandoned houses, the basements, the sewer tunnels, as a warehouse. He's running weapons. Military grade. Stuff I ain't seen since Kandahar. Selling them to gangs, militias, anyone with the cash." Hattie stared at him, the pieces clicking into place with a sickening finality. The fires. The accidents. Mrs. Petrov. Mr. O'Malley. It wasn't just gentrification. It was a criminal conspiracy. "My buddy Rook, he's a data specialist. He got this," Sledge tapped the hard drive. "Tonight. From a server in the basement of the old Paquette auto plant. Ledgers, shipping manifests, bank transfers. It's all there. It's enough to burn Prescott to the ground." "So, who shot him?" Hattie whispered, dreading the answer. "We were set up," Sledge said, his voice hardening. "We got the drive and were heading out of the city to lay low, but they were waiting for us. An ambush. 2 black SUVs, no plates. Men in tactical gear. They knew we were coming." He pointed to Rook. "They shot him. They sabotaged our bikes. Cut the fuel lines. We ran. We ran as far as we could in the snow before he just collapsed. This storm, it's the only thing that let us get this far. It's the only thing hiding us." Hattie leaned against the counter, her legs weak. The full, crushing weight of her decision hit her. She hadn't just let in 9 strangers. She had let in a war. She was sitting on the evidence that could destroy the most powerful man in the city. And his private army was out there in the storm hunting them. Her neighborhood wasn't just dying. It was being murdered. And the killers were now looking for the men she had just hidden in her house. A fragile, brittle trust had been forged in blood and whiskey. Hattie, exhausted, finally sat down at the table, across from the hard drive that felt heavier than an anchor. Sledge watched her, his respect a palpable thing. He had seen surgeons in field hospitals with less steady hands. This old woman, in her threadbare cardigan and slippers, hadn't just saved his man's life. She had done it with the grit of a seasoned combat medic. She was, he realized, a warrior just like them. The rest of his men had settled into a quiet, alert state of exhaustion, the adrenaline of the chase finally ebbing, replaced by the crushing cold of the house. "He'll sleep now," Hattie said, her voice a low murmur. She was looking at Rook, who was bundled in every blanket she owned. "We need to keep him warm. The shock. The cold is as dangerous as the bullet was." Sledge nodded. "We'll take turns. Keep him covered." He looked around the freezing kitchen, at the frost already forming on the inside of the windows. "Ma'am, you—" He was cut off by a sudden jarring noise. The 13-inch television on the counter, the one Hattie had turned off hours ago, flickered to life. Its screen was a mess of snowy static, the audio a high-pitched whine. "What's that?" the young kid asked, jumping to his feet. Power's probably surging, Hattie said, rubbing her temples. It does that before. The static cleared. The screen resolved into a special report banner, flashing red and white over the local news logo. A shaken anchorwoman was on screen, her hair slightly mussed. We interrupt this emergency broadcast, she said, her voice tight with practiced gravity, for a developing story that has rocked the city tonight. We are going to a live, somber press conference with Councilman Cade Prescott. Hattie's stomach clenched. Sledge tensed, moving closer to the small screen. The other men rose silently, drawn by the name. The image switched to City Hall. Cade Prescott stood at the podium, the same one from the morning's news segment. But the smooth, polished politician was gone. This Prescott looked devastated. His tie was loosened, his eyes were red-rimmed, and he gripped the sides of the podium as if for support. Tonight, Prescott began, his voice thick with emotion, is a night of profound tragedy for our city. He paused, taking a shaky breath. As our brave first responders fight this unprecedented storm, a dark evil has used the chaos as cover. He looked directly into the camera, and Hattie felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. We have just received confirmation that 2 of Detroit's finest, 2 decorated police officers, fathers, husbands, have been ambushed and murdered. A collective gasp went through the press corps. Sledge and his men stared at the screen, their faces draining of color. What is he talking about? The braided man whispered. The officers, Prescott continued, his voice breaking with what looked like genuine grief, were responding to a tip about a weapons cache at the old Paquette plant when they were attacked. Gunned down by a violent, local motorcycle gang. Hattie's hand went to her mouth. No, this was not a robbery. This was an execution, Prescott declared, his sorrow hardening into a cold, righteous fury. The group responsible, a known criminal element calling themselves the Forgotten Sons, are to be considered armed and extremely dangerous. They are armed with military-grade weapons. They are fleeing the scene. And we will not rest until these cop killers are brought to justice. A picture flashed on the screen. It was a grainy black and white security photo. It showed 9 men in leather vests, their faces obscured, but their identities unmistakable. It was them. The small kitchen was plunged into a stunned, horrified silence. The only sound was the howling of the wind outside and Prescott's voice, now a venomous whisper. They murdered 2 of our heroes in cold blood. Sledge turned to look at Hattie. His face was as gray as Rook's had been. The trust, the bond they had just formed over the kitchen table, shattered. Ma'am? Sledge started, his voice a strangled rasp. You lied to me, Hattie whispered, backing away from him, her eyes wide with terror. She wasn't just in a house with men who were being hunted. She was in a house with men who had killed cops. You said they were mercenaries. You said they were. Sledge insisted, his voice rising in desperation. They weren't in uniform. They were in tactical gear, black SUVs, no plates. It was an ambush. He's lying. But the damage was done. The man on the TV was a snake, but he was an elected official. The men in her house were, what? A biker gang. And now, according to every channel in America, they were cop killers. This was the twist of the knife. Prescott wasn't just hunting them. He had already tried and convicted them in the court of public opinion. He had turned the entire state's police force into his personal hunting party. Prescott is a master manipulator, using the media to spin his poisonous lies, just like people do every single day to get what they want. He counts on fear. He counts on you believing his version of the truth. Comment, I stand for the truth, below if you're tired of people like Cade Prescott controlling the narrative. Hattie looked from the hard drive on her counter, to the dying man on her table, to the faces of the 8 other men who were now, officially, the most wanted men in Michigan. Her crumbling house, with no heat and no phone, was no longer just a shelter. It was a coffin. And she had just locked herself inside with 9 men the entire world believed were murderers. The tiny 13-inch screen spat static, then defaulted to a NO signal message, plunging the kitchen back into a thick, suffocating silence. Prescott's poisonous words hung in the air, more chilling than the frost creeping across the linoleum floor. Hattie was breathing in short, shallow gasps, her back pressed hard against the peeling wallpaper of her hallway. Cop killers, she whispered, the words tasting like ash. You brought this to my house. "Ma'am, listen to me," Sledge pleaded, taking a step toward her, his hands held up, open and empty. "He's twisting it. He's feeding the media a story. Those were not cops. They were his men. His cleanup crew. And how do I know that?" Hattie's voice was sharp, brittle with a new, colder fear. "How do I know you're not the wolf and he's the one who's been killing your neighborhood?" Sledge's voice was a low, desperate growl. "He's the one who burns people out of their homes. You know it? You know what he is." Hattie's eyes darted between Sledge, the hard drive, and the man she had just saved. Her entire moral compass was spinning. She had believed Sledge. She had trusted him. The intimacy of the last hour, the shared, bloody work of saving a life, felt like a violation. But the image of Prescott's slick, lying face from that morning, that too was a truth she couldn't ignore. Who was the monster? The one on her TV or the one in her kitchen? The decision was taken from her. Sledge. The voice was quiet, deadly calm. It came from the thin man, the one who had been standing silent guard at the front living room window. His name was Wraith. He hadn't moved in an hour, a statue of denim and leather. "What is it?" Sledge asked, moving instantly to his side. Wraith didn't turn. He just tilted his head, peeling back the heavy floral drape a single careful inch. 2 cars. Cruisers. Just turned onto the street from the main drag. A jolt of pure adrenaline shot through Hattie. "Police? Oh, thank God. They're here. You have to surrender. You have to tell them your story. Give them the drive." Sledge didn't even look at her. He pressed his own eye to the gap in the curtain. The wind howled, a perfect, shrieking cover. "Ma'am," Sledge said, his voice flat, all the desperation gone, replaced by a chilling, professional calm. "Their lights are off." Hattie's blood froze. "What?" "2 police cruisers," Sledge narrated, his voice a grim monotone. "Rolling silent. No lights. In a blizzard. They're not here for a noise complaint." He watched them roll to a stop, one in front of her house, one blocking the alley. "They're parking. Fanning out." "But, they're police," Hattie stammered, clinging to the last shred of order. "They have to be." "They're wearing black," Sledge said. "Full tactical. Not standard issue blue. They're carrying long guns." He let the curtain fall, the heavy fabric muffling the outside world once more. He turned to face his men. The time for debate was over. "This is it," Sledge announced. "They're not here to arrest us. They're here to clean up." He pointed to the braided man. "Grizz, take the kid. Barricade the front door. Use the big sofa and that heavy cabinet. To Wraith, take the back. We don't let him in." The men moved with an instant, terrifying efficiency. The illusion of a chaotic biker gang evaporated. This was a fire team. This was a military squad. They heaved her heavy oak and velvet sofa, a piece that hadn't been moved in 30 years, and slammed it against the front door. "Ma'am," Sledge said, grabbing her arm. His grip was firm but not violent. "Where is your basement?" "Through the kitchen," she whispered, her mind numb. "Get in it. And stay down. Don't come up. No matter what you hear." He pushed her toward the kitchen. And just as she reached the basement door, it happened. Click. FFFT. The single, bare bulb in the kitchen, her only light source, went out. The green, blinking 12 o'clock on her ancient microwave died. The entire house was plunged into an absolute, suffocating darkness. He cut the power. Wraith's voice came from the blackness. There at the breaker box. The only light in the world was the chaotic, churning white of the blizzard outside the windows. The house, her crumbling fortress, was now a blind, cold tomb. Hattie fumbled for the basement doorknob, her heart trying to hammer its way out of her chest. Trapped. Surrounded by corruption with no way out. No light. No heat. No hope. That's exactly how Cade Prescott wants Hattie to feel. That's how he wins. He makes good people feel so helpless they just give up. If you're rooting for Hattie and the Sons to find a way out, hit subscribe right now. Only those who want the villain to win would ignore this. Hattie pulled the basement door open, the smell of damp earth and motor oil, Walter's old workshop, wafting up. She took one step down onto the wooden stairs. Crack. The sound was not the wind. It was from the back porch. It was the sound of a heavy boot splintering the frame of her back door. Sledge, who was a shadow in the darkness, yelled, "Wraith! Contact!" Hattie froze, her foot hovering over the second step. She heard a thud as the kitchen door flew open, slamming against her refrigerator. A figure, silhouetted against the blinding white of the storm, stood in the doorway. He was tall, dressed in black from head to toe, his face obscured by a gas mask and helmet. He took one step into her kitchen. A high-intensity beam of white light, mounted on the barrel of his rifle, snapped on. It lanced through the darkness, a solid, terrifying cone of light. The beam swept past the bundled form of Rook on the table, past Sledge, who was diving for cover behind the counter. It swept past the basement door and then it snapped back. The light found Hattie Palmer. It pinned her, a deer in the headlights, her hand on the doorknob, her eyes wide with pure, undiluted terror. The man in black stood perfectly still, his rifle and its blinding light aimed directly at Hattie's face. The world compressed to a single, blinding point of white light. Hattie was frozen, her hand on the brass knob of the basement door, her heart a dry, dead thing in her chest. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't move. The man in the doorway was a faceless specter of death, and he was here for her. She was a loose end. A witness. A casualty of a war she hadn't known existed until an hour ago. Time stretched, became brittle. The only sound was the wind, the man's masked breathing, and the blood roaring in Hattie's ears. Then the darkness to her right exploded. No. Sledge's roar was a primal force. He didn't dive for cover. He launched. A 250-pound mass of muscle and leather, he exploded from behind the kitchen counter, tackling the mercenary at the knees. The impact was a brutal, wet crack of bone and gear. The rifle discharged, a deafening boom 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 that was nothing like the movies. The bullets went wild, tearing through Hattie's ceiling, raining down plaster and 100-year-old laugh. The high-intensity flashlight beam went crazy, spinning wildly around the room, illuminating a chaotic hell of flailing limbs and falling cupboards. The single violent act was a starting gun. From the front of the house, a new sound, crash. The sound of the living room picture window imploding, followed by the deep, concussive thump-thump-thump of gunfire, deeper and heavier than the mercenary's rifle. Grizz. Front door. Sledge roared, his voice muffled as he wrestled with the man on the kitchen floor. There through the window. Grizz's voice was a panicked yell. Rafe. There in the living room. The house, Hattie's quiet, crumbling sanctuary, had instantly transformed into a war zone. It was a dark, frigid, thundering coffin, and the undertakers were already inside. Hattie was still on the stairs, her mind shattered, her body paralyzed by the sheer, overwhelming violence. This is it. This is how I die. In the dark. For nothing. She could smell the gunfire now, a sharp, metallic, chemical smell that burned her nose. A new figure appeared in the kitchen doorway, silhouetted against the blizzard. Another mercenary. He raised his rifle, aiming at the thrashing forms of Sledge and the first attacker. Get down, old lady, a new voice barked. It was the young kid, the one who had looked so scared. His name was Ghost. He was suddenly between Hattie and the new mercenary. He shoved her hard, pushing her off the top stair and into the dark hallway. The shove saved her life. The mercenary's rifle fired, and the bullets ripped through the exact spot where Hattie had been standing, splintering the basement doorframe. Ghost didn't run. He raised a handgun and fired twice. The sound in the narrow hallway was deafening, a physical blow to Hattie's eardrums. The mercenary in the kitchen doorway grunted, staggered back, and disappeared. Ghost grabbed the front of Hattie's cardigan. Where are you going? The study. Hattie screamed, her voice a reedy, terrified wail. My husband, the radio. Ghost's eyes widened in the dark. He seemed to understand instantly. It was insane. It was impossible. It was the only chance they had. Go, he yelled. He turned, placing his body between her and the kitchen. I'll hold this hallway. He began firing toward the kitchen again, providing a deafening, terrifying wall of covering fire. Hattie didn't hesitate. She turned and ran. She half crawled, half stumbled down the pitch-black hallway, her arthritic hands sliding along the peeling wallpaper. The house was an inferno of sound. Shouting from the living room. The thwack-thwack-thwack of suppressed rounds, a sound she shouldn't recognize but did, answered by the deafening roar of the bikers' handguns. Plaster dust rained down from the ceiling, filling her lungs, making her choke. It was dark, she was blind, and the house was a labyrinth of death. She reached the end of the hall. The study. Walter's room. She slammed the door shut, her fumbling, numb fingers finding the old brass lock. A useless, fragile defense, but it was something. The room was black. Blacker than the hallway. She groped for the desk lamp, her hand knocking over a cup full of old pens. It was dead. Of course it was dead. The power was cut. Her eyes, frantic, found the desk. And on it, the Cobra 148 GTL. A black, lifeless brick. The amber display was dark. No, 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 she whimpered, her hands running over the cold, dead metal. Please, Walter, please. The battery. The battery. Walter was a pack rat. He was a tinkerer. He always had a backup. He always had a backup. She dropped to her knees, her hands sweeping under the desk, through a spiderweb of old cables and dust bunnies. Her fingers brushed against a cold, metal box. Yes, she dragged it out. The emergency battery pack he used for his ham radio. It was heavy, a slab of lead and steel. She fumbled with the connections, her fingers thick and stupid with cold and terror. She couldn't see. She was doing it by feel, by a 15-year-old memory of him showing her how it worked. Just in case, hat. Just in case the big one hits. Crack. An explosion of sound and light erupted just to her left. A bullet ripped through the study wall, inches from her head. It struck a framed photograph on the wall. Her and Walter, 1968, his arm around her, both of them young and smiling. The glass exploded, showering her with tiny, glittering shards. Hattie screamed, a raw, sharp sound. But her hands didn't stop. She found the positive terminal. She found the negative. She jammed the connectors on. A low, electric hum filled the room. The Cobra's amber display flickered, then glowed to life, bathing Hattie's face in a warm, angelic light. CH-19. It was alive. She scrambled up, grabbing Walter's old leather-bound logbook from the desk drawer. She ripped it open. And there on the first page in his neat, meticulous script, Wrench. And underneath, a list of other names, other call signs. Salmon. Gator. Preacher. Artec. His old unit. Men he'd served with. Men who, he claimed, would walk through hell for each other. But are they still listening? After 40 years? A heavy thud hit the study door. Ma'am? Open up. It was Ghost. They're pushing in. I can't hold them. Another series of gunshots, deafeningly close. Hattie grabbed the cold, black microphone. Her thumb, stiff and arthritic, fumbled for the button on the side. She pressed it. The TX, transmit, light glowed red. Hello, she whispered, her voice a reedy tremor. Is anyone there? Please. She let go. The speaker hissed back at her. KSSSSSHHHHHHHH. Static. Just static and the faint, ghostly howl of the blizzard's interference. No, that's not right. Think, Hattie. How did he talk? You have to be strong. She remembered Walter's voice, sitting in this very chair, his voice changing, becoming deeper, more formal when he keyed the mic. You got to have a handle, Hat. She needed a handle. She was in a house that was supposed to be her safe harbor, her anchor. But it was a trap. No, it's not a trap. It's the anchor. It's where we make our stand. She keyed the mic again. Her voice was shaking, but a new, cold steel had entered it. The steel of Walter's widow. This is the anchor. I am under siege. I repeat, I am under siege at 1412 East Grand. My home. We have a man down and hostile forces are at the wire. They are in the house. She took a gasping breath, the words pouring out. They are not police. They are mercenaries. Any old dust-offs on this frequency? Any friends of Wrench? Any friends of Walter Wrench Palmer? We need you now. He would have come for you. Please, come for us. She released the key. Her entire life, the lives of the 9 men in her house, hung in the balance of the next sound. Kisses. Nothing. A soul-crushing, empty, howling static. The blizzard. The empty airwaves. No one was listening. No one was out there. It was a stupid, foolish, desperate fantasy. Walter was gone. His friends were gone. She was alone. The hope was a lie. The study door splintered behind her. A boot kicked it open. Ghost fell into the room, landing hard on his back. He looked up at her, his face pale. I'm sorry, ma'am. They're everywhere. A tall, dark figure in tactical gear filled the doorway, his rifle leveling at Ghost. Hattie could hear Sledge roaring her name from somewhere deep in the house. a sound of pure animalistic rage. The fight was lost. She looked at the radio, at the glowing, mocking amber light. She looked at the shattered picture of her and Walter. She picked up the mic one last time. She didn't press the button. She just held it to her lips, her voice a broken whisper, a prayer to a dead radio. God help us. They're in the house. Walter. I'm sorry. She let the microphone fall from her numb fingers, its coiled cord swinging like a pendulum. Hattie is fighting back even when all hope seems lost. She refuses to let Prescott and his corruption win. Like this story, if you believe in fighting back against bullies, no matter how powerful they are. The mercenary in the doorway of the study didn't fire. He took a slow, deliberate step into the room, his rifle's beam pinning Ghost to the floor. Hattie was frozen, her back against the desk, the dead microphone swaying beside her. The sounds of the fight in the living room were desperate, shouts, the crash of furniture, and the terrifying, sporadic pop-pop-pop of the son's handguns against the thwack-thwack of the mercenary's suppressed rifles. It was an uneven slaughter. Where is it? The mercenary's voice was a flat, synthesized rasp from behind his mask. The drive. Ghost, lying on his back, spat a mouthful of blood onto the floor. Go to hell. The mercenary raised his rifle, aiming at Ghost's head. Hattie screamed, a raw, hopeless sound. Keras click. The sound was impossibly, painfully loud. It wasn't a gunshot. It was the sound of the CB radio speaker crackling to life. A voice, rough as gravel and amplified by static, blasted into the room. The anchor, this is Sandman. We read you loud and clear. Hattie's head snapped up. The mercenary froze, momentarily distracted by the new sound. Ghost seized the opening. He wasn't reaching for a gun. He launched himself, grabbing the mercenary's rifle, forcing the barrel up just as it fired. The bullets went harmlessly into the ceiling. The radio crackled again, a different voice this time, booming with authority. Wrench's widow? This is Gator. We are 1 minute out. Tell your boys to keep their heads down. Traffic is hell. The mercenary, snarling, kicked Ghost in the stomach, sending him sprawling. He turned his rifle back toward Hattie, who was now scrambling to grab the microphone. They can't hear you, she shrieked, pressing the transmit button. They're in the living room. They're cornered. The mercenary lunged for her, grabbing the microphone cord. We copy anchor. Tell him the cavalry is on the way. Dustoff is inbound. The fight in the living room had reached a fever pitch. Sledge let out a roar of pain. We're out. Grizz yelled. Sledge, I'm out of ammo. The mercenaries were advancing. Hattie could hear their heavy boots in the hallway. They were done playing. They were moving in for the kill. Sledge, behind Walter's overturned mahogany writing desk, pulled out his last magazine. He had 8 rounds left. Rook was unconscious or maybe dead on the floor behind him, covered in plaster dust. It was a good run, boys, Sledge panted, chambering around. The lead mercenary stepped into the living room, his rifle light finding Sledge's face. Just as the mercenary raised his rifle to fire the final, fatal shot, Sledge heard it. He heard the voice from the CB radio echoing down the hall. Copy anchor. Tell him the cavalry is on the way. Sledge's head snapped up. His eyes, wild with exhaustion and rage, suddenly lit with a new, terrifying, manic hope. He threw his head back and laughed. It was not a sound of humor. It was a raw, fierce, primal bark of defiance. Hold on. Sledge roared, his voice tearing through the house, louder than the gunfire. Hold the line. The mercenary paused, confused by this sudden, insane shift. What could a cornered, bleeding man possibly have to laugh about? And then he heard it too. It started as a low, deep rumble, a vibration that Hattie felt in the floorboards before she heard it. It was a sound that didn't just compete with the blizzard. It devoured it. It was not the sound of 2 cruisers. It was the sound of dozens of engines. Big engines. The angry, guttural roar of Harleys, the high-torque whine of modified 4x4s, the thunder of heavy-duty diesel trucks. The mercenary in the study with Hattie froze. His head tilted. He heard it. Through the blizzard's howl, a symphony of vehicular rage was descending on 1412 East Grand. The mercenary in the living room, the one aiming at Sledge, made his decision. He pulled the trigger. Click. His rifle was empty. Sledge didn't hesitate. He vaulted over the desk, a 250-pound berserker, and tackled the mercenary, his combat knife flashing. Outside, the world exploded. It wasn't a battle, it was an annihilation. Walter's old network, grizzled, off-grid veterans in their 60s and 70s, slammed into Prescott's four-man cleanup crew from all sides. Headlights from a dozen jacked-up trucks and jeeps lit the front yard like a stadium, turning the blizzard into a swirling vortex of white and light. These weren't bikers. This was a mechanized infantry. 2 mercenaries who had been guarding the perimeter were cut down before they could even raise their rifles. The other 2, the ones who had breached the house, heard the sudden, overwhelming chaos. The hunter had become the prey. The mercenary in the study with Hattie shoved Ghost aside and scrambled back toward the hallway. The front door, which had been barricaded by Hattie's sofa, didn't just open. It disintegrated. A massive boot kicked it off its hinges, sending the heavy oak and velvet barricade flying into the living room as if it were cardboard. A man stood in the ruined doorway, silhouetted against the blinding wall of headlights. He was even bigger than Sledge, with a wild, gray beard and a face that looked like it had been carved from a block of granite. He wore an old-school flak jacket over a denim vest. He was holding a sawed-off shotgun. He took in the scene. The bullets, the plaster, the dead mercenary on the floor, Sledge standing over him, bleeding from a cut on his forehead. Then he saw Hattie trembling in the hallway, clutching the CB microphone. He racked a shell into the shotgun, the shuck-shuck, a sound of final, terrible authority. He stepped inside, his boots crunching on the glass of Hattie's shattered picture frames. He was Sandman. He nodded at Sledge, a silent greeting of respect from one generation of warrior to another. Then he walked straight to Hattie. He gently took her arm, helping her to her feet from where she'd fallen. His eyes, incredibly, were kind. "Sorry we're late, ma'am," he said, his gravelly voice even rougher in person. Traffic was hell. Real loyalty just showed up. Prescott's world is built on greed and lies, but Walter's was built on a bond that lasts 40 years. Comment loyalty below if you know that's a power no amount of money can buy. By the time the first real police sirens cut through the dawn, the scene at 1412 East Grand was one of surreal calm. The blizzard had broken, and the rising sun cast a clean, pink light over the snow-covered battlefield. Federal agents, alerted by an anonymous, but very specific, tip from Sandman's network, swarmed the property. They found Hattie Palmer wrapped in a blanket, sitting at her ruined kitchen table, drinking fresh coffee brewed on a camp stove. She was calmly talking to 2 men, Sandman, who was cleaning his shotgun, and Sledge, who was clutching the hard drive in his fist. They found Rook, alive and stable, being treated by a grizzled vet with a medic bag who introduced himself as Document. They found 2 dead mercenaries, 2 others zip-tied and waiting on the porch, and a small armory in the mercenaries' cruisers. The trafficking ring, so carefully constructed by Cade Prescott, shattered in less than an hour. The hard drive, handed over to a grim-faced FBI agent, was the final nail. Prescott was arrested before his 9 a.m. staff meeting, his somber face from the press conference now a mask of pure reptilian shock as he was led away in handcuffs. The cop killer narrative evaporated, replaced by the story of a corrupt councilman and his private army. The Forgotten Sons, now cleared of all charges, didn't just thank Hattie, they adopted her. 2 days later, a new army descended on her house. This time they carried tool belts and lumber, not shotguns and rifles. It was Sledge's men, Walter's old network, and a dozen other vets who had heard the story on the grapevine. The payoff was not a renovation, it was a fortification. They didn't just patch the roof, they built a new one. They didn't just fix the furnace, they installed a new high-efficiency system, along with a backup generator. The splintered doors were replaced with reinforced steel. New double-paned windows were set in every frame. Walter's study was transformed. The walls were insulated and his old Cobra radio was wired into a new, powerful antenna on the roof, alongside modern communications gear. Her house, once a symbol of her isolation, became the official, protected headquarters for the new neighborhood. Hattie, no longer a recluse, became the anchor, the linchpin of a community that was suddenly fiercely alive. She managed the communications, coordinating the Baker Tango, Biker Tough, network of veteran patrols. Her loneliness was gone, replaced by a house full of noise, purpose, and the constant smell of coffee. The house, once crumbling, now stood as a symbol. Even in the worst storm, one person's courage could still turn the tide. Hattie and the vets took their community back from a corrupt, power-hungry politician. If you believe communities are stronger than corporate greed, hit that subscribe button. Let's build a community right here that Prescott would hate.